They thought they were stealing from the perfect daughter-in-law, but in truth, they were signing away everything they owned, and the quiet woman standing in their living room knew it long before they ever did. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below. And if you believe respect should never be based on appearances, make sure you stay with this story, because what happened next left an entire family speechless. Emily Carter stood near the wide bay window of the Whitmore estate, sunlight spilling across the polished hardwood floors, her hands gently folded in front of her, as if she had nowhere else to be, her soft cream cardigan and simple pearl earrings blending seamlessly into the background of a house that never truly felt like hers, at least not in the way everyone else assumed. To them, Emily was the perfect daughter-in-law, polite, attentive, always present yet never imposing, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays, kept the kitchen running smoothly, and smiled through every subtle remark that suggested she should feel grateful just to be there. Across the room, Margaret Whitmore sat upright on a velvet armchair, her posture rigid, her fingers tapping lightly against a stack of neatly arranged papers resting on the glass coffee table, her sharp eyes flicking toward Emily with a glance that carried just enough warmth to pass as civility, but never enough to resemble genuine acceptance. Daniel Whitmore stood near the fireplace, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit, his expression distracted, as if he were already somewhere else, leaving the conversation and the decision unfolding in the room, entirely in the hands of his mother and sister. Caroline Whitmore leaned casually against the edge of the table, her arms crossed, her lips curved into a faint smile that never quite reached her eyes, watching Emily the way someone might observe a harmless guest who had overstayed her welcome. They had discussed this plan for weeks, quietly, carefully, convinced they were the only ones in control, convinced that Emily, with her calm demeanor and unassuming presence, would never question a thing, never suspect that the documents placed before her were more than routine family arrangements. The air in the room felt heavier than usual, not tense in the way arguments felt, but controlled, deliberate, like a performance where everyone knew their role except the one person they believed didn't matter. Margaret cleared her throat softly, sliding the papers forward an inch, the faint sound of paper against glass echoing louder than it should have in the otherwise silent room, and for a brief moment, no one spoke. Emily's eyes moved from the window to the table, then to the faces surrounding her, calm, steady, unreadable, as if she were taking in a scene she had already seen before. And somewhere beneath the stillness, beneath the polite smiles and carefully chosen words waiting to be spoken, something had already shifted, something none of them were prepared to understand, because the woman they believed they were about to outmaneuver had never been as simple as they needed her to be, and in that quiet moment, the outcome of everything had already been decided. Emily stepped forward without hesitation, the soft sound of her flats brushing against the floor barely noticeable, yet somehow drawing every eye in the room as if her movement carried more weight than anyone expected, and for the first time that afternoon, the carefully controlled rhythm of the Whitmore household felt slightly off balance, like a performance missing a cue that no one could quite identify. She reached the table and looked down at the documents, her gaze steady, not rushed, not uncertain, as though she were reading something far more familiar than the others would ever imagine, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the glass surface, while Margaret leaned forward just enough to reclaim authority over the moment. "It is just a formality," Margaret said, her tone smooth but firm, the kind of voice that had spent decades making decisions without being questioned, something that will simplify the management of family assets going forward. Caroline let out a small, almost amused breath, tilting her head as she added, "You would not want to complicate things for Daniel, especially now, right?" Her words were wrapped in concern, but the intention beneath them was unmistakable, a quiet push disguised as kindness. Daniel remained silent, his eyes briefly meeting Emily's before drifting away again, his hesitation subtle but present, as if somewhere deep down he understood that something about this moment did not feel entirely right, yet not enough to interrupt what his family had already set into motion. Emily said nothing at first, her silence stretching just long enough to make the room aware of itself, of the ticking clock on the far wall, of the faint hum of the air conditioning, of the unspoken expectation hanging between them. She lifted the first page gently, scanning the lines with a calm precision that did not match the version of her they had all grown comfortable believing in, and Margaret's fingers tightened slightly against the armrest as she watched, a flicker of impatience crossing her otherwise composed expression. "If there is anything you do not understand," Margaret continued, her voice sharpening just a fraction, "we can explain it to you." Emily looked up then, meeting her gaze with a softness that revealed nothing, and offered a small, polite smile that seemed to reassure them all while giving nothing away. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice even, almost gentle, and something about the certainty in those two words caused Caroline's smile to falter for the briefest second before she quickly recovered. There was no resistance, no argument, none of the hesitation they had anticipated, and that alone felt like confirmation to them that everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Emily reached for the pen placed neatly beside the papers, holding it with steady hands, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as if each second carried meaning only she could see, and as the tip of the pen hovered just above the signature line, a subtle shift passed through her expression, not visible enough to alarm, but enough to suggest that the moment they believed belonged to them had quietly changed direction. In that silence, where expectation had already turned into quiet victory in their minds, Emily lowered the pen and paused, just long enough for the air in the room to tighten again, her eyes briefly flicking toward the hallway, as if acknowledging something unseen, something approaching, and when she finally spoke again, her voice remained calm, almost reassuring, yet carried a weight none of them recognized until much later. "Before I sign," she said softly, "there is just one small detail we should clarify." And for the first time since the conversation began, Margaret Whitmore did not immediately respond, because somewhere beneath her confidence, a quiet, unfamiliar uncertainty had begun to take shape, and the room, once so controlled, began to feel just slightly out of her reach. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, the brief hesitation in her posture quickly masked by a composed smile that had been practiced over years of maintaining control in every room she entered, and yet something in Emily's tone lingered longer than it should have, like a note that did not quite resolve, unsettling in a way no one immediately acknowledged. "What detail?" Margaret asked, her voice calm but no longer as effortless as before, her fingers now resting still against the armrest, as if she were measuring every second more carefully. Caroline shifted her weight, uncrossing and recrossing her arms, the faintest crease forming between her brows as she watched Emily with a sharper focus, no longer dismissing her as easily as she had just moments ago. Daniel finally looked directly at Emily again, this time holding his gaze there, something uncertain flickering beneath his usual composure, as if he were beginning to sense that the situation was no longer unfolding according to the quiet assumptions they had all agreed upon. Emily lowered the pen gently onto the table, the soft click echoing in the silence, and straightened slightly, her posture still relaxed but no longer blending into the background the way it had before, as if the version of her they had grown accustomed to was quietly stepping aside. "The structure of these documents," she said, her voice even and measured, "assumes that I am transferring my rights into a trust controlled by the Whitmore family." She paused, allowing the words to settle, her eyes moving calmly from Margaret to Caroline, then to Daniel, not searching for approval, not seeking reassurance, simply observing. "But that structure only works if the assets in question originate from this family." A subtle shift passed through the room, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable, like the air itself had changed direction, and for the first time, no one responded immediately. Margaret's lips parted slightly before closing again, her gaze sharpening as she leaned forward just a fraction, the confidence in her expression now carrying a hint of calculation. "Of course they do," she replied, her tone firmer now, as if re-establishing ground she believed could not be questioned. "Everything you have access to came through this family." Emily's expression did not change, but something in her eyes grew steadier, clearer, as though she had been waiting for that exact statement. "That is not entirely accurate," she said softly, and the simplicity of her words carried more weight than any raised voice could have. Caroline let out a short, disbelieving laugh, shaking her head as if dismissing the comment before it could take shape. "Emily, please," she said, her tone edged with impatience. "You do not need to overcomplicate this. We are trying to help you. But the word help seemed to linger awkwardly in the space between them, no longer as convincing as it had sounded minutes ago. Emily reached for the top page again, lifting it slightly, her fingers steady, her movements precise, and for the first time, there was something unmistakably deliberate in the way she handled the document, as though she were no longer a participant in their plan, but something else entirely. If I sign this as written, she continued, her voice calm, almost gentle, it would suggest that the Whitmore family holds primary claim over these assets. She placed the paper back down, aligning it carefully with the stack, a small, controlled motion that seemed to emphasize every word she had just spoken. But legally, she added, her eyes meeting Margaret's once more, unwavering now, that is not the case. The room fell still again, but this time the silence felt different, heavier, as if something had shifted beyond correction, and for the first time, the certainty that had filled the Whitmore household began to fracture, not loudly, not all at once, but in quiet, undeniable ways that none of them were prepared to face. Margaret's composure did not break all at once, but the shift was unmistakable, a subtle tightening around her eyes, a stillness in her posture that replaced the effortless authority she had carried just moments before, as if the ground beneath her certainty had quietly begun to move. That is a very bold statement, she said slowly, each word measured now, no longer delivered with casual dominance, but with careful control, as though she were recalibrating in real time, searching for the angle that would return the situation to her grasp. Caroline's expression hardened, the earlier amusement gone entirely, replaced by something sharper, more defensive, her gaze fixed on Emily as if trying to force her back into the role she had always played. You are overthinking this, she said, her tone no longer polite, the edge now visible. These are standard agreements. Everyone signs them. There is nothing unusual here. Daniel exhaled quietly, running a hand along the back of his neck, his discomfort no longer hidden, though he still said nothing, caught between the weight of his family's expectations and the growing realization that Emily was no longer simply agreeing along. Emily did not react to the tension, did not raise her voice or shift her tone, and that stillness only made the change in the room more pronounced, because while the others were adjusting, she remained completely steady, as if she had already moved beyond this moment long before it arrived. Standard agreements rely on accurate assumptions, she replied gently, her voice calm, not confrontational, yet carrying a clarity that made it impossible to dismiss. And this one is built on an assumption that is not correct. The silence that followed stretched longer this time, heavier, the kind of silence that does not invite interruption but instead demands understanding, and Margaret leaned forward slightly, her gaze narrowing as she studied Emily with a new intensity, no longer seeing a compliant daughter-in-law, but something she had not accounted for. Then perhaps you would like to explain, Margaret said, her tone now firm but cautious, as though each word had to land precisely. Emily inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the request, and for a brief moment, the quiet returned to her expression, but it was no longer the quiet of someone blending in, it was the quiet of someone choosing exactly how much to reveal. When Daniel and I married, she began, her voice even, almost reflective, there were several financial arrangements made to support the expansion of the Whitmore holdings. Caroline's eyes flicked toward Margaret, a quick, almost imperceptible glance, as if confirming something already known, but Emily continued before either of them could respond. Those arrangements were not structured as gifts, she added, her gaze steady now. They were structured as investments. The word hung in the air with unexpected weight, and Daniel's head lifted slightly, his attention sharpening, as if a memory had just been triggered, something he had not fully understood at the time. Margaret's expression did not change, but her fingers curled slightly against the armrest, the smallest sign that her control was no longer absolute. Investments require ownership, Emily continued, her tone still calm, almost gentle, yet each word landing with quiet precision. And ownership carries rights that cannot simply be reassigned without proper authority. Caroline let out a short breath, shaking her head, but this time there was no confidence in it, only resistance. This is not about ownership, she said quickly, her voice rising just enough to break the rhythm that had settled in the room. This is about family. Emily's eyes softened slightly at that, not with agreement, but with something closer to understanding, as if she had anticipated that exact response. Family, she repeated quietly, and for a brief second, there was a hint of something deeper in her expression, something that acknowledged the word while also revealing its limitations. Should not require documents like these to prove trust. The room fell silent again, but this silence was no longer controlled, no longer part of a plan. It was uncertain, shifting, and for the first time, the power that had once filled the Whitmore home no longer felt entirely theirs to command. Margaret did not speak immediately, and that alone said more than any response she could have offered, because for a woman who had built her entire identity on certainty, on always knowing exactly where she stood and where everyone else belonged, silence was unfamiliar territory, and the longer it lingered, the more it revealed. Caroline shifted again, her movements sharper now, less controlled, as if the carefully constructed narrative they had relied on was beginning to slip through her fingers, and she was not prepared to let it go without resistance. "This is getting unnecessary," she said, her voice carrying a forced steadiness that did not quite hold. "We are not discussing technicalities. We are discussing what is best for the family." Emily remained still, her expression calm, her gaze steady, not challenging, not defensive, simply present in a way that made every word spoken around her feel more exposed. "Technicalities are what define ownership," she replied gently, her tone unchanged, and the quiet precision of her words made them harder to dismiss than any argument could have. Daniel took a step forward then, his hesitation finally giving way to something closer to concern, his eyes moving between his mother, his sister, and Emily, as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer aligned. "Emily," he said carefully, his voice lower now, more personal, "what exactly are you saying?" For a brief moment, the room seemed to narrow around that question, as if everything that followed would no longer be contained within polite conversation, and Emily looked at him, really looked at him, her expression soft but unwavering. "I am saying," she began, her voice calm, measured, "that the assets tied to these documents were not built solely by this family." She let the words settle, not rushing to fill the silence that followed, allowing the weight of them to take shape on their own. Margaret straightened slightly, her composure returning in fragments, but this time it felt constructed, deliberate, as though she were holding it in place rather than embodying it. "Then explain where they came from," she said, her tone firm again, though now edged with something sharper, something that bordered on demand rather than assumption. Emily nodded once, a small, acknowledging motion, and reached for her handbag resting neatly on the side table, a simple gesture that carried no urgency, no drama, yet somehow drew every ounce of attention in the room. She opened it slowly, retrieving a thin, folded document, placing it beside the stack already on the table, aligning it with the same careful precision she had shown before. "These agreements," she said, lightly touching the papers Margaret had presented, "reference a series of capital infusions made over the past 5 years. Caroline's eyes flicked toward the document Emily had placed down, her expression tightening as if something about it felt unfamiliar, out of place in a conversation she had believed fully controlled. "Those infusions," Emily continued, her voice steady, "were not internal." The word hung in the air, quiet but disruptive, and Daniel's brow furrowed slightly, the pieces beginning to shift in his mind, though not yet fully forming. Margaret's gaze dropped briefly to the new document, then lifted again to Emily, her eyes sharper now, searching, calculating, as if trying to identify the exact moment the balance had changed. "If they were not internal," she said slowly, "then they were external contributions, which still places them under the authority of this family once integrated." Emily's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not of amusement, but of recognition, as if she had expected that reasoning all along. "Only if the contributor relinquished control," she replied softly, and for the first time, there was something unmistakably definitive in her tone, something that did not invite interpretation. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence carried a different weight, heavier, undeniable, because the assumption that had once held everything together was no longer intact, and as the seconds passed, It became clear that whatever truth Emily was about to reveal had already begun to rewrite everything they thought they understood. Margaret's gaze remained fixed on Emily, but the certainty behind it had begun to fracture in ways she could no longer fully conceal, and for the first time, the authority she had always carried so effortlessly felt like something she had to actively hold together. "Then clarify it," she said, her voice controlled but no longer as smooth, the demand in her tone now unmistakable. "Who exactly holds that control?" The question lingered in the room, heavier than any before it, because it was no longer asked from a place of dominance, but from a place of necessity, and everyone present felt the shift whether they admitted it or not. Emily did not answer immediately, and that pause, deliberate and unhurried, seemed to stretch longer than it should have, filling the space with a quiet tension that no one interrupted. She reached for the document she had placed beside the others and gently unfolded it, the soft sound of paper moving echoing in the silence. And when she placed it flat on the table, she turned it slightly, so it faced Margaret. "The original agreements were structured through a holding entity," she said calmly, her voice steady. "One that retained controlling interest in every contribution made." Caroline stepped closer without realizing it, her curiosity now outweighing her resistance, her eyes scanning the document as if trying to understand something that did not align with what she had always believed. "That does not change anything," she said quickly, though her voice lacked the confidence it once carried. "Those entities are always aligned with the family." Emily's gaze shifted briefly toward her, not confrontational, but certain. "Not always," she replied softly, and the simplicity of the statement carried a weight that silenced any immediate rebuttal. Daniel moved closer as well, his attention now fully drawn to the document, his brow furrowed as recognition began to form, not fully clear, but enough to unsettle him. "I remember this," he said slowly, his voice quieter, more thoughtful. "There was a partnership agreement early on, something about external backing during expansion." Margaret's eyes flicked toward him, sharp, immediate, as if that memory was not one she had intended to resurface, but Emily continued before the moment could be redirected. "That partnership," she said, her tone calm, precise, "was not a passive contribution." She placed her hand lightly on the document, her fingers resting near a signature line that had remained unnoticed until now. It established controlling interest. The words settled into the room with undeniable clarity, and for the first time, no one attempted to interrupt, because the meaning behind them was beginning to take shape in ways that could no longer be dismissed. Caroline's expression shifted, the resistance in her posture giving way to something closer to disbelief, her eyes moving between Emily and the document as if trying to reconcile two realities that refused to align. "That would mean," she began, but the sentence faltered before it could be completed. Margaret leaned forward then, her composure tightening again, but this time it felt more like containment than control, her eyes scanning the document with a focus that bordered on urgency, searching for something, anything, that would restore the balance she had always maintained. "Who signed this?" she asked, her voice quieter now, but far more intense, the question no longer rhetorical, no longer dismissive. Emily's hand remained steady against the paper, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but there was something unmistakably final in the stillness she carried, as if the answer had been present all along, waiting only for the right moment to be seen. She lifted her gaze to meet Margaret's, her eyes clear, unwavering, and when she spoke, her voice remained soft, yet carried a certainty that filled the entire room. "I did." The silence that followed was absolute, not a single movement, not a single breath breaking the stillness, because in that moment, everything they thought they controlled had shifted beyond their reach, and none of them were prepared for what that truly meant. The words did not echo, yet they lingered in the room with a weight that felt impossible to ignore, settling into every corner of the space, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the meaning behind them. And for a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because the reality unfolding in front of them did not match anything they had prepared for. Caroline was the first to react, though not with certainty, but with disbelief that came too quickly, too defensively, her voice breaking the silence in a way that only revealed how unsteady she had become. "That does not make sense," she said, her tone sharp but uneven, her eyes moving rapidly between Emily and the document, as if searching for a flaw that would restore the version of events she understood. You cannot just sign something like that and claim control over an entire structure. Emily did not respond immediately, her gaze remaining calm, her posture unchanged, and it was that stillness that made Caroline's words feel smaller than she intended. It was not just a signature, Emily said finally, her voice quiet, steady. It was a condition. Daniel's expression shifted further, the confusion in his eyes deepening into something closer to realization, as pieces that once seemed insignificant began to align in ways he could no longer ignore. The expansion phase, he said slowly, almost to himself. The delays, the negotiations, the reason everything suddenly stabilized. His voice trailed off as he looked at Emily, truly seeing her for the first time not as someone who had entered his life quietly, but as someone who had been shaping it long before he understood how. Margaret remained still, but her silence was no longer composed. It was calculating, her eyes fixed on the document, scanning every line with a focus that bordered on urgency, as if she could undo what had already been revealed by simply finding the right detail. If what you are saying is true, she said carefully, her voice lower now, more deliberate, then this entity you refer to would have had to maintain operational oversight the entire time. Emily inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the point without resistance. It did, she replied softly, and the simplicity of her answer carried a certainty that left no room for interpretation. Caroline let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, though there was no humor in it, only disbelief that had nowhere else to go. So what are you saying, she pressed, her voice rising slightly despite her attempt to control it, that this entire family has been operating under someone else's authority without knowing it? Emily's eyes met hers, calm, steady, without judgment, and for a moment, there was something almost compassionate in her expression, as if she understood exactly how difficult that truth was to accept. Not someone else's, she said gently, someone you chose not to see. The words settled heavily, not as an accusation, but as a quiet reflection of everything that had led them to this moment, and Daniel looked down briefly, his jaw tightening as the weight of that realization began to take hold. Margaret straightened slightly, her composure returning in fragments, though now it felt sharper, more guarded, as if she were bracing against something she could not fully control. Then clarify it completely, she said, her voice firm once more, though no longer untouchable. What exactly is your role in all of this? Emily did not hesitate this time, did not pause, did not soften the truth any further, and when she spoke, her voice remained calm, but carried a clarity that left no room for doubt. I am the controlling partner, she said, and the room went completely silent, not because they did not hear her, but because for the first time, they understood exactly what that meant, and nothing in their world would remain the same after it. The silence did not break immediately, and that was what made it unbearable, because no one in that room had ever imagined a moment where words would fail them completely, where the carefully built hierarchy of power and control would collapse without warning, leaving nothing but the truth standing quietly in its place. Caroline took a small step back, almost instinctively, her arms no longer crossed in confidence, but hanging uncertainly at her sides, her expression caught between disbelief and something far more unsettling, the slow realization that everything she had dismissed had been real all along. That is not possible, she said, but this time her voice was lower, less certain, as if even she no longer fully believed the words she was saying. Daniel remained still, his eyes fixed on Emily, searching, processing, replaying years of moments that suddenly felt different, moments where her quiet presence had not been passive, but intentional, where her silence had not been ignorance, but choice. You never said anything, he said finally, his voice not accusatory, but confused, almost fragile, as if the version of their relationship he understood had quietly unraveled in front of him. Emily looked at him, her expression softening slightly, but her composure never wavering. You never asked, she replied gently, and the simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it was not said with blame, only with truth. Margaret exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that seemed to steady her just enough to speak again, though the authority in her voice had shifted into something more guarded, more precise. "If you hold controlling interest," she said carefully, "then you would also hold decision-making power over every asset tied to this structure." Emily nodded once, a small, deliberate motion. "That is correct," she said, her tone even, unshaken, and the confirmation settled into the room like a final piece falling into place. Caroline shook her head, her frustration now surfacing more openly, though it no longer carried dominance, only resistance against a reality she did not want to accept. "Then why stay quiet?" she pressed, her voice rising slightly. "Why let everyone believe something else?" Emily's gaze moved across the room, taking in each of them, not with judgment, not with superiority, but with a clarity that felt impossible to challenge. "Because how people treat you when they think you have nothing," she said softly, "tells you everything about who they are." The words landed with a quiet finality that no one interrupted, because they were not spoken as an argument, but as a conclusion already reached. Margaret's eyes lowered briefly to the documents on the table, her fingers resting lightly against the edge, no longer tapping, no longer directing, simply still, as if the weight of what had been revealed had finally settled in. "Then these papers," she said after a moment, her voice quieter now, more measured than it had ever been. "They hold no authority without your approval." Emily's gaze returned to the documents, then back to Margaret, her expression calm, steady, unchanged. "They never did," she replied, and the room fell silent once more, not with tension this time, but with understanding, because the power they thought they had been securing had never belonged to them at all, and the woman they had tried to control had been the one holding everything together from the very beginning. No one reached for the documents anymore, and that alone marked the end of something that had once felt permanent, because the authority that had filled the room only minutes before had quietly dissolved, leaving behind a stillness that no one could control or reshape. Margaret sat back slowly, her posture no longer rigid with command but held together with restraint, her gaze lingering on the papers as if they no longer belonged to her world, as if the certainty she had built over decades had been reduced to something fragile, something she could not simply reclaim with a word or a decision. Caroline looked away first, her eyes drifting toward the window where Emily had once stood unnoticed, her expression unsettled, no longer searching for an argument, no longer pushing back, because there was nothing left to challenge, only something to accept, and that acceptance did not come easily. Daniel remained where he was, his attention fixed on Emily, but the way he looked at her had changed completely, the quiet familiarity replaced by something deeper, something more complex, as if he were finally beginning to understand that the woman he thought he knew had always been far more than what he allowed himself to see. "So what happens now?" he asked quietly, not as a demand, not as a challenge, but as a question that carried the weight of everything that had just shifted. Emily did not answer immediately, and the pause that followed was not uncertainty, but consideration, as if she were choosing her words with the same care she had chosen her silence all along. She reached forward and gently gathered the documents, stacking them neatly, aligning each page with calm precision, a simple action that now carried meaning none of them could ignore. "Nothing changes unless it needs to," she said softly, her voice even, unhurried. "But control will no longer be assumed." The words were not harsh, not delivered with anger, but they settled into the room with quiet finality, drawing a clear line between what had been and what would no longer continue. Margaret's lips parted slightly, as if she might respond, but no words followed, because for the first time, she understood that this was not a negotiation she could influence, not a situation she could redirect, and the realization settled heavily, leaving her silent. Caroline glanced briefly toward her mother, then back at Emily, her expression uncertain, the confidence that once defined her replaced by something more cautious, more aware, as if she were seeing the consequences of her own assumptions for the first time. Daniel took a slow breath, his shoulders lowering slightly, the tension in him easing not because everything was resolved, but because the truth, however unexpected, had finally been spoken. Emily stood. Then, her movements calm, unhurried, as she placed the documents back on the table, not as something to be signed, but as something already decided, and for a moment, she looked at each of them, not with judgment, not with triumph, but with a quiet clarity that needed no explanation. "Respect is not something you request through paperwork," she said gently, her eyes steady. "It is something you show when no one is watching." No one responded, because there was nothing left to say that could change what had already been revealed. And as Emily turned and walked toward the doorway, the soft sound of her steps echoing lightly through the once controlled space, the room remained still, not with tension, not with resistance, but with the quiet understanding that everything they thought they held had always been in the hands of the one person they chose to overlook, and that day, without raising her voice or demanding anything in return, she had reminded them exactly what dignity looks like.